Good morning. Time now 8 a.m. On the October 12th, Thursday in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar program. My name is Koichi Mori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online morning seminar programs in order to introduce the latest edition of the World Bank report presented by the authors of those reports, who actually are the World Bank economists and specialists. Every year, twice a year, actually, in the spring and fall, each of the regional chief economist offices issue the economic update of the respective regions. And we have established a good tradition to introduce each one of them once issued. This morning, we are going to feature the East Asia and the Pacific Economic Update, subtitled Services for Development, which was issued on the October the 1st earlier this month. We have Elgis Islamaj, who is a senior economist from the Office of the Chief Economist for East Asia and the Pacific region, who actually is the regular speaker in our seminar program. Good morning, Elgis. Thanks for joining.
Good morning, Koichi. Thanks for inviting me as always.
Great. Thank you very much. So as usual, we are going to listen to Elgis presenting the latest edition of the East Asia and the Pacific economic update for probably 30-40 minutes. Then I will read the questions on your behalf. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so by sending your questions using the online form posted on the website announcement of this seminar, or you can simply send an email directly to me, or you can also simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. So I'll read your question on your behalf. So with that, I would like to formally invite Elgis to come in to start his presentation. Elgis, please.
Thank you, Koichi. Grateful if you can confirm that you see the slides.
Yes.
They're working properly. Okay. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to come and present in your seminar, because for us, this is the first presentation after we launched the update, and it's a sign that, from now on, we're done with the hard work and we can focus on disseminating. And we also get very good questions from your audience, and that's always challenging, but I'm looking forward to interacting with them rather than giving them a definite answer. So we do these updates twice a year, and since COVID, we focus more on having like an integrated approach, right? So usually some other updates in the bank or some other semi-annual publication in the bank have this part 1 and part 2. So now, as we are moving more and more away from the COVID shock, we are kind of going back to the part 1 and part 2. And so in some way, this update reflects that. So we don't want these updates to basically talk about everything that is happening with the region or the countries, but we want to basically give a general overview and then focus on one specific topic. And this time, our topic of focus is services for development. We actually see, and our colleagues are working on this, and in the near future, there will be a separate report that's focused on services. But we see this as a big opportunity for the region to support and enhance its development. Let me say beforehand, at the beginning, that we want to make this clear that we're not basically saying that, not manufacturing anymore, but services. So we don't see services as separate from manufacturing, but increasing the productivity of services and enhancing services, basically bringing in more reforms to the services sector and bringing in more technologies will not only increase the productivity of services, which do make up about half of these economies, but also will help improve productivity in manufacturing as well. So let me go through the details, and then we can come back to this at the end. So as usual, we try to structure our report around recent developments, what has happened. We highlight three concerns that we have with recent developments and other major changes, major shocks or structural changes that are happening in the region that will develop in one way or another. But also, as I said, we highlight this opportunity, which is developing the services sector. So first, let me begin by highlighting some good news. If some of you saw the media coverage of this report, we are very proud of it. But let me start by saying that some of these messages that I'm going to say today probably were not evident from the press coverage of the report, because the press always focuses on the more negative and shocking part of the report. But the good news is that most countries in the region have recovered from the succession of shocks that we saw in the last few years. Some countries like China and Vietnam today have output which is as much as 20% higher from pre-pandemic. But not just these two countries, also other major economies, think Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, output is about 10% higher than it was before the pandemic. But of course, there are also some bad news. Countries in the Pacific, especially Myanmar, they are still struggling. And an outlier is Palau, where output is still 20% below where it was before the pandemic. At the same time, so basically most economies have recovered and the region is growing, but the region is growing at a slower rate. So if you look at the slope of what is happening between Q1 and Q2, the slope of this curve that represents the index of GDP, then you're going to see that the slope is flatter, which translates into slower growth. So what we do in this update, we try to first understand what is shaping the performance of the region, and what are some of the risks and opportunities going forward. So first, this is a region that depends a lot on trade and which is also open to finance. And this region that has benefited from trade and is open to finance is naturally affected by the global environment. Now, 2023 was a year in which the global growth slowed, right? And that meant less demands for the region's exports. At the same time, 2023 was a year where many industrial countries increased their interest rates, basically engaged in financial tightening, as they were struggling to control inflation. Now, this combination, you're going to see later, this combination of slowing growth in the global economy and tightening financial conditions, especially in the major advanced economies, led us to make projections for 2023, which are lower than those for 2022. Now, looking ahead, we expect global growth to revive. I mean, these are not, strictly speaking, our unit's projections. These are, the projections of the global team, and also the IMF is projecting the same thing. So we expect the global growth to revive, and we also expect financial conditions to ease somewhat, because inflation in major countries is a little bit under control. It has not come down yet, but it's still, it's not going up anymore. So this combination has led us to project somewhat higher growth in 2024 than in 2023. But this picture, which is actually a generally positive picture, is affected, and we believe will be affected by three concerns. And at the same time, in front of us, laying ahead, is also one big opportunity that we identify. So the first concern is that across the region, we see today a problem of increased indebtedness. This is not, a phenomenon that happened in just a few countries. It is true in every country. And it is true for government debt, it is true for corporate debt, and it is true also for household debt. But, if you focus on what happened in the last couple of years, maybe some countries have tried to deleverage the corporate sectors, or households in some countries, they are focusing more on paying debts than consuming. But generally speaking, if we look in the last decade, we see that debt across all dimensions has increased. Now, in some countries, the problem is more acute. For example, for government debt, we don't really show in this chart Mongolia or Lao PDR, but we know that they have high levels of especially external debt, and corporate debt in Vietnam and China is also high. It's probably as much as 40% higher than it was in a decade ago. And household debt also is elevated in China, Malaysia, Thailand, for example. Now, why does this matter? Well, this matters because debt, and in the report we have some empirical analysis to support this, is that this debt weighs on households, so they spend less, so it affects their consumption. It also weighs on governments and also in the corporate sector in a way that it affects both the public and private investment. So that kind of puts some constraints on aggregate demand. So we're not necessarily saying that it's falling because of this, but compared to what it could have been without the elevated debt in some countries, it is growing by less. Now, the second concern is about what is happening in China. Now here, I'll talk for maybe a minute or so with a blank screen, so it's not an accident, because I want first to lay out what is happening in China, right? First, China matters for the whole region. We know that. I think we've shown that in previous updates as well. And per our calculations, 1 percentage point decrease in China's growth lowers the growth in the rest of the region on average by as much as 0.3 percentage points per year, right? So it is a quite significant effect. Now, China's current performance nowadays is being shaped both by how it chose to grow in the past, but also how it aspires to grow in the future. What do we mean by this? Well, we mean that in the past, the emphasis was on growth through investment, especially on infrastructure and real estate. And what this did, yes, it helped develop a country a lot, but also, there was a lot of focus on investment, which, especially in the last decade, it happened by increasing debt. Now, China, and this has featured, there was a box in the last update, and it has aspirations to grow in the future, better, for one way of saying it, to have a more inclusive growth in the sense that the fruits of growth could be shared more broadly. It could be more stable. That's at least how we see that it's tied to dealing with some of the problems of excessive leverage in the real estate sector, and try to anticipate risk in the financial sector. And also it's been trying to grow more sustainably by moving away from emission intensive sectors. And also, maybe not what we expected a few years ago, but also to grow more autonomously in terms of relying more on its own technologies rather than interacting more with the rest of the world. So this has created, so both, now they were growing a lot because the emphasis was on investment. Now they're going to grow through consumption and through innovation. And by doing that, automatically, China is giving up some of the short-term growth for longer-term, higher quality growth. Now, to make these transitions, combined with the shocks that we saw in the last few years, sometimes the instruments that were chosen were not very efficient, and some of the policies exacerbated uncertainty, both for consumers, but also for investment. And then combine this with the falling prices in the real estate sector, and then what we end up with is a decline in consumer confidence, and an increase in uncertainty, especially economic policy uncertainty. So we saw, as we see from the chart, especially when it was trying to finally get through and transition to opening up from the public health restriction that it had during COVID, we saw consumer confidence falling, and it didn't go up, at least up to the point where data is available. At the same time, some econometric work, some empirical analysis that we have done shows that the economic uncertainty as measured by these measures, that pioneered by Bloom and the IMF, is keeping good track of those, has lowered investment. So this evidence is with firm-level data, which allows us to zoom in on various sectors. And what we can see is that sectors that were the more affected were the sectors of like education, internet-based services that were probably subject to some, really unexpected policy changes. So now, this is the problem with one of the largest markets in the region, but also, one of the major trading partners of the region. But this is not the only problem. The other problem, the other concern that we see is what's happening outside there, in the rest of the world. And what we have been seeing recently is that around the world, the restrictions that are being imposed on global trade, have increased. Like in 2022, they were 3 times as large as those in 2019. And, they were quite significant higher in 2019 as of August of 2023, and they probably will go up for the rest of the year. In particular, as I showed, many countries are kind of showing a tendency to retreat from openness that characterized, global trade and financial system, in the last 2-3 decades. But in particular, some of the policies that the US has been undertaking recently, trade and industrial policies by the US, we believe are beginning to affect the exports in the region. What we have shown, and I think it is well documented by now, and we've shown this in the past update, is that when the United States and China start engaging in, the trade tensions or trade wars, when they start imposing tariffs on each other around the middle of 2018, the exports shifted away, at least the exports to the US, shifted away from China and towards other ASEAN economies. So in many ways, the ASEAN economies started emerging as winners from this so-called trade war. For example, notably Vietnam is the example that comes to everybody's mind. But more recently, the introduction of the US Inflation and Reduction Act and the CHIPS Acts, and in particular the provisions in these agreements which attach some local content requirement to the subsidies granted under these acts, have been followed by a decline in exports from the region, not just for China, but also in other ASEAN economies. Now, if you look at this chart, yes, it looks like they're declining, but it could be for a variety of reasons, and in particular, since the global economy is also going down, maybe that is the reason. But what we tried to do, and there's some work in the background, some empirical work, is that if you look at other countries with which the US, for example, had free trade agreements, like, for example, the US and Canada, like the NAFTA bloc, or as it's called now, USMCA, these countries were exempt from these local content requirements, and we see that their exports continued to grow. So this difference in performance is like a difference approach, in technical language of econometrics, but this helps us disentangle the effects of this X that, we can say, well, what happened? Once we control for a bunch of things, we see that probably this was the culprit for why exports started declining from the region. Okay, so again, if you there can be other reasons, but it seems like at least the preliminary evidence that we started putting forward is suggesting that there was an effect of U.S. industrial policy. Now, just to take a quick look at what was the performance of the economic activity in the region. So as I said, for all these reasons combined, exports have been declining and they're actually been in negative territory. But some good news again is that the tourist arrivals has started to go back to pre-pandemic levels, and then that has contributed to growth in some countries. But either it's reaching where it was or it's plateauing. So probably that growth is because it was growth from a low base. So now probably we're going to see less support from tourists, but it has supported growth, especially in countries like Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Cambodia that are open to services, and of course Fiji. I mean, the tourism is important in those countries. Now, again, we looked at this evidence, and what we saw that looking at retail sales data, which is a proxy for consumption, data suggests that there is divergence in consumption from pre-COVID levels. So it is not the case that just consumption went down during COVID or during these other shocks that followed, and then it's catching up, but it's still caught up. But no, we see that the trend have flattened, and it is more evident in China. But in other regions' economies, it basically started increasing rapidly initially, but then it was flattening again. And if you also look at investment, and this has been going on for several years, and this is some basically empirical evidence that shows the correlates of inflation, and it includes both private and government debt and policy uncertainty of affecting investment. But the truth is that private investment has struggled, and it has been either decreasing or flat in several AP economies for some time. So again, you might say, oh, but last year it increased here, it went up there, down there. But generally speaking, we're seeing that it's struggling. It's been a little bit constrained. At times, especially during the crisis, we've talked about government intervention. Now, we just point out, and I think we mentioned this before, that fiscal policy has become less expansionary in most countries. This chart shows the change in structural balance. Just as a point of reference, think of what happened in the year 2020 and 2021. There was a big shock. The fiscal policy became more expansionary. So for expansion fiscal policy, this should be negative. And then what we're seeing is that in 2023, the structural balance, the projected structural balance, the change in structural balance is all positive, which means that fiscal policy is not as expansionary as it has been in the last couple of years, with the exception of Indonesia, but Indonesia has an exceptionally expansionary policy in the previous year. At the same time, monetary policy, again, interest rates are higher than they were, maybe a year ago. So it has tightened most of the region, and this happened because of the global financial tightening. Now, inflation is not as big of a concern as it was a year ago or 6 months ago in the region. So some countries, like Vietnam and China, they're starting to lower the interest rates to support their economies, but still overall interest rates are higher than they were last year. And if we think about that chart that I showed you at the beginning, where what is happening with the global interest rates, with the global financial tightening, again, is coming down a bit, but it's still higher than it was before the pandemic in the US and in Europe. So to sum up this section, growth prospects have weakened since the previous forecast, but the good news is that they are still higher than in other emerging markets. So EAP still reflects higher growth. If we go back and compare with what we projected in April, they're slightly lower. But then again, the picture is, especially in 2024, is that of China's growth suffering from all the shocks that we discussed, but the rest of the region slightly benefiting from some improvements in the global economy. Okay, so after talking about these concerns, I want to turn now to what we see as a big opportunity for the region, which is the services sector. And a sector which, as you can guess from the title here, Harnessing the Digital Revolution to Reform, is being transformed through what we refer to as the digital revolution. Now, how do we think about this services reform overall? Well, this is when we start, what I've been saying in the past, but also, what is happening, how important it is, what is its potential. So we want to put things into perspective first. And we start this part of the report by highlighting, I think we say 7 facts about services. I'm not going to list 7 facts here because it becomes too much, but I'm going to list some of them at least. So, and the idea of these 7 facts was to acknowledge and recognize that services sector are already important. So it's not that now we say, oh, let's just choose to stop what we're doing and start from scratch going into services. No, services are there. In many economies, or in most economies, they account for at least half of employment and half of value added in economies in the region. Now, maybe we have been guilty of a little bit of productivity pessimism in the services sectors in the past, but what we noticed once we were really digging into the data is that the productivity pessimism with which the services sector was regarded is not completely justified, because especially, yes, manufacturing played a large role in the region, this development, for several decades. But if we zoom in, especially in the last decade, services have contributed more than manufacturing to labor productivity growth in the region. Now, another fact that we highlight is that exports of services and foreign investment in services have grown faster than exports of manufacturing and foreign investment in goods, basically. Now, again, it's a little bit of a base effect, but this shows that the services sectors have been rapidly increasing its importance in the economy last decade or 2 decades, and again, or at least since the 2008 crisis, and this is something we showed in the last update as well. And finally, services are more skill intensive. They are more female labor intensive, so basically they employ more females, and they are also less carbon intensive than manufacturing. Of course, here the transportation is a little bit of an outlier, but when we look at the report, I don't think I'm going to talk about it today. Now, let me look at the timing. Okay, we can continue for another 10 minutes. So, as I said, first we talk about the digital revolution and services reform. Again, very basically, just to give you guys, a sense of what is going on. We have seen all these venture funds, all these, fintech technologies entering the region, and they're basically increasing their presence. And then on the right, you see this is services trade policy restrictive index. So if you compare the line, the blue dots, which are approximated by the blue dashed line, with the orange dashed line, you see that it's higher. Higher means more liberalized. So, higher means more restrictive. So lower means more liberalized. So we see that, in the last decade, services have become more open. So basically, they have benefited from digitalization, and they have been subject to reform, which means that they have hopefully become more efficient and more open. Now, because we went and collected evidence and we did a lot of work in the background, based on that evidence, that evidence shaped our thinking, and this is the framework that we see the importance of services sector in the economy. Basically, it goes something like this. Now, this evidence, I'm going to show some of that to you, but especially we relied on data from the Philippines, from Vietnam. Especially, I mean, it was impressive how open and transparent, some of these countries were with the data, but also with some evidence from Indonesia that I'm going to show you. Now, these new technologies that are being embedded in services, combined with services policy reforms that have been implemented, or in some cases, Indonesia and Philippines are still being implemented, but they are on the right track, are increasing productivity of some services sectors, like communication, finance, business services, right? The best examples, right? And they are also changing the nature of jobs. This is the first and main result. And again, this comes from evidence. Now, the story does not end here. These, improvements in productivity of these sectors and the digitalization of these sectors is also being transmitted and is helping improve productivity in agriculture, manufacturing, and other services which use communications, finance, transport, and businesses as inputs. The consequence of this thing that we see is basically enhance opportunities, especially as a first order for people who have skills. Now, this is only one part of the story. Now, the good news is that the same policy reforms and technologies that I'm talking about have been transforming education, healthcare, and they've been doing this in a way that they've helped equip people with capacities to basically take advantage of these enhanced opportunities. So basically, we see the services reforms and the new technologies creating a virtuous cycle between the economic opportunity and human capacity, right? So as we improve education, then more people can take advantage of services, more people can contribute and also benefit from what is happening with the service reform. So it's more like a virtuous cycle that goes both ways. Now, again, I promise you that I'm going to tell you why it matters for productivity, this digitalization and reform. First, some evidence from the Philippines. Firm level data from the Philippines show that services firms, in fact, are using here these technologies more than manufacturing, right? Maybe this is not surprising, even though there is heterogeneity across sectors. Now, the use of these technologies is associated with higher total factor productivity. And this is true for data and software, information technology, e-commerce, etc. Now, again, right, data is a little bit fragmented, but we did the best that we could, and some of this work was really novel. Now, with data from Vietnam, what we did, we showed that reforms, basically liberalization, removing barriers to entry and competition, increased the labor productivity of services firms. Again, this is a great result, straightforward, but at the same time, it also increased the productivity of manufacturing firms, especially those in downstream industries, and especially the small and medium enterprises. So one of the things that we say in the report is that actually services reform is actually a very powerful industrial policy, because it helps not just the services sector, but also, it transmits, it propagates to manufacturing. Now, it also basically all these technologies and reforms also help transform jobs Now, the question, we turn to the question of what kind of jobs are being generated in these new digital services. And this comes with evidence from Indonesia that shows that digital workers tend to have higher level of education, compared to non-digital workers. And these digital workers dominate the more technical services like ICT, finance, professional services, etc. Now, the good news is that other big employers like retail and wholesale and in accommodation, they also basically employ a significant share of non-digital jobs, where they employ less skilled workers for non-digital jobs. So other evidence, but again, there's more of this in the report, digital jobs do earn a wage premium, and this has increased over time. Now, why this matters? This is basically the other side. We talked about the demand side, but on the supply side, so this is like the right-hand side of that diagram that I showed you. Digital technology and reforms are helping improve the outcomes in education. EdTech, for example, being combined with well-trained, well-motivated, and well-selected teachers. And in many cases, these digital technologies are also improving healthcare, making it possible to provide, for example, integrated healthcare, as this example from the Henan province in China demonstrates. And again, more details on this is in the report. So, as I said, we see this, digitalization and reforms as an interactive relationship between opportunity and capacity. And this will be at the heart of development, or at the heart of benefiting from these opportunities that services represent. But this may not happen, unfortunately, may not happen automatically, right? We emphasize in the report that countries need to reform to harness opportunities. First, they need to liberalize. For example, the Philippines has taken steps in liberalizing services through the Public Services Act, but they also need to be mindful. So liberalization should also come in tandem with some regulation. So ideally, countries would not let a few services or high-tech firms take large market share, or basically behave as monopolies and hurt welfare. At the same time, there's still huge gaps across the region, both in skills and in infrastructure, and we show some evidence about that. At the same time, cooperation on data and decarbonization across countries remains very important for the region, but also for the world, to basically enhance this faith on these services, that is, sharing data, increasing the security of data even across borders, and also improve productivity, as we just highlighted. So I think I'm out of time. Let me stop here. I had also included some basically slides to show the importance of these reforms in the region, why it's important. For example, we look at here, for example, this is the internet coverage, although they have like mobile internet, the speed of broadband fixed lines, which is associated with increased productivity in firms that they need broadband to benefit from some of the technology can feed into their productivity, is a little bit heterogeneous in the region. If you look, for example, at Indonesia or some other parts of inland in our countries. So anyways, let me stop here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or go back to any slides if needed.
Great. Thank you very much, Egis, for your presentation, giving us a snapshot of the latest edition of the East Asia and the Pacific Economic Update. We received some questions from the viewers in advance. Let me read each one of them. First one, how do you see the impact and opportunities by service sectors and the technologies for the Pacific Island countries? Can these countries take advantage of service sectors and digital technologies like other major countries? So this is the first question. Actually, the question from Sasaki-san. Thank you for your question. Elgis, please.
Thanks, Koichi. That is actually a very central and very important questions because it presents an opportunity for the Pacific Islands, but also the challenges for those countries are larger. First, let me say that if you visit our website, and I think the website is linked in the slides that Koichi has posted online, you can find access to a lot of materials, including all the data for the charts in the report. Now, in the report, we do have a little bit of a special focus on islands. So inside the special focus on services, we have a box which does a special focus on islands, and there are some things that can be done. There are also limitations, but we believe that this basically the sharing of services represent opportunities across islands. I will not go too much in details, but for example, there are differences in practices, right? For example, accounting practices across these Pacific Islands. So if you have now, it to some extreme, it doesn't make sense for every country to try to have its own big firms, but where some of these services can be shared across borders and increase productivity in that way. But because the accounting systems are different, then it doesn't recognize licenses from other countries, then it becomes problematic. I guess a more basic and more problematic thing is transportation, like how to resolve that. And again, we try to think out loud more than give a definite solution about some ideas, because in some cases you have some solutions where some of these island countries that they hang on and invest a lot on these national airlines, which I guess they were there for a reason, and the reason is because if you leave it to the market, then there might be really so the cost of flying there might not justify the demand, and they might have say no flights at all. But if we can think of regional hubs or like a way to guarantee both availability of say flights, transportation to at least the main locations across the Pacific Islands, but at the same time share the costs, because we can see how it becomes economically efficient if each of these countries has its own ran its own separate airline, whereas like a more combined effort can provide benefits. Again, this is a very challenging question, so I will not try to explain. But another more straightforward idea can be in education, right? So again, rather than having campuses each island, several of them can combine and have like a university that serves students across different locations, and they can benefit from that. But again, it's a very important question. It's not easy. You can come with counterfactuals that what one says, things cannot work out. That's why in the report we emphasize when it comes to services is basically reforms like liberalization and regulation, right? So try to open up, make them more efficient, but not move the market to an extreme where something is a monopoly and they can dictate what they want to do. So and again, but while this liberalization and so well in the report, the way I presented the liberalization and regulation were presented as something pertaining to specific countries, like for example China or other countries, and then the international cooperation of these services, especially data sharing, across location, was separated as a different thing. Pacific Islands we can say liberalization, regulation, and cooperation as well should come together to make sure that they get the services and things become more efficient.
Thank you for your responses, Regis. Another question from the same person. Let me read. China has been the driver of the poverty reduction in the region for more than a decade. Other than China, what are the key elements for the region to achieve the ending poverty goal in which countries in the regions? So, any responses, Regis, please?
So, mechanically, mathematically, if we look at the number of people who are lifted out of poverty in China, it has driven the reduction of poverty in the region, right? But we should not underestimate that all the countries in the region have basically decreased poverty, and actually have immense progress in reducing poverty over the last 3 decades. Now, they have relied, China has produced very significant positive spillovers for the rest of the region. So the rest of the region has benefited from China, and that has helped them grow, and growth has been translated to poverty reduction. Now, at the same time, many of the major economies in the region, if you think of Southeast Asia, for example, they have had a diversified export base, and especially FDI has come from other countries, including more developed economies in the region. What happens there, it basically depends what model of growth are they going to choose, right? If they continue to emphasize or to heavily invest on an investment-driven model, sometimes also called an export-led growth model, then eventually they will run into these problems where a slowdown in China should translate in less exports to China, and then slowdown in the global economy will also mean less exports there, and this will hurt growth in their own countries, and it means fewer people lifted out of poverty. But in the last couple of years, many countries of the region have been boasting their robust domestic demand, right? So, and I think this is important for China, and it's also important for other countries in the region to continue strengthening their domestic demand, also through paying more attention to the services sectors, as we emphasize in this report. And that's happened. Maybe in nominal terms will mean, when it comes to the headline number of growth, will mean lower growth, but it will also mean higher quality of growth that's focused, that is dependent on consumption. It will mean less dependence on outside shocks, which will mean more stability of consumption, less volatility, and this will basically help that people that are lifted out of poverty, they don't fall back in poverty. So I think it's a very important question, and we emphasized it a lot, but there's a lot of strength in the region, and I think we should play to their strength, especially when it comes to important questions like poverty. And then what has been happening in the last decade actually is and it was kind of accelerated with the COVID crisis. We see also more focus on redistribution, which basically, when you put it all together, what has been happening is after having great success in lowering poverty through growth, now they are also paying more attention to inequality, and also inequality has declined in several countries in the region, but a lot of work still remains to be done.
Thank you for your responses, Elgis. We received a question and comment from the Professor Naoki Yoshino of Keio University. Thank you very much, Professor Yoshino, for sending your point. Let me read. Different kinds of services, such as finance, the tourism sector, healthcare, education, need different kinds of technological progress. Especially in the Asia region, SMEs, small and medium enterprises, are dominating the services sector. Should the government provide support to SMEs to introduce higher technology? What would be the best way to improve to make SMEs much more efficient? So those are the points and questions raised by Yoshino Sensei. Elgis, any comment responses, please? Thank you.
First of all, let me thank Professor Yoshino. He always has very insightful questions, and thank you for following our update and our work at the World Bank. It's a very important question. I don't think we basically touch upon that or have been in a position to recommend that in the World Bank, because pretty much what we've been saying is that this is a region that liberalized the trade of goods quite significantly and benefited from that. But, you know, when you look, I don't know if there was a chart in my presentation, but we've shown this in several updates as well. If you look at the restrictions in the services sector, they remain higher compared to other regions on average. Like, so basically, there was always this reluctance in the region, and this includes countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and of course China, where you have this very open goods sector, and they're very open to trading goods, but they remain closed. Restrictions remain high in services trade, and also there is room, there's potential for services to become more liberalized, basically lower barriers, both externally and internally. So what the evidence that we have put together shows is that continuing with those reforms or applying some of the reforms that we've seen in some countries, extending them to other countries as well. So basically liberalizing will first help give you a bang for the buck. Then later, if there's any specific interventions that can be done, I don't think we touch upon that in the report, and I don't think I'm in a position to recommend that at this point. But very nice question, and it also helps me clarify that, you know, basically we before we go and, you know, the way some people put it, like more interventions that can help, but it can also do more harm. Let's first try to get rid of some of the restrictions and then help the economy through that. And then we can think about what's wrong.
Thank you, Eric. So you responded to all the questions that we received. So before wrapping up, any final remarks from you, Ergis?
So first of all, thanks again to everybody, and I hope that, you know, we have put together an interesting update. This come every 6 months. These are routine from all institutions, but something that gives a sense of what is happening in the region, gives a framework of how to think about it. Of course, it does not answer all the questions to all individual countries, but at least it helps us think through this framework. But also, I want to emphasize, you know, the importance of services, and hope you will join us. So if you were like us, that, you know, really thought that, you know, this is a region that where growth was led by manufacturing, and now moving into services was a disaster. I want to probably lay it out there that, you know, that is not the case. First, think even mathematically, right? If services is half of the economy and you double productivity or say you increase productivity by 10% in services, it should mean a lot compared to like another service, another sector that is much smaller share of the economy, right? So even mechanically, those improvements contribute a lot to growth. But then through this digitization and the way that services are being used by manufacturing and by other sectors, it has the potential to propagate and give even higher returns. So I believe this is a sector, services, we should look at them more closely as engines of growth in the region.
Thank you. So joining us this morning from Washington, we had the Ergis Islamaj, who is a senior economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for East Asia and the Pacific region. Thank you very much, Ergis, for your time to present the report. And we will see you in 6 months' time.
My pleasure and looking forward. Thank you, Koichi.
Great. Thank you very much. So we are going to continue our journey through different regions. Next week, we are going to feature the Africa's Pulse, which is the Africa region's version of the regional economic update. We are going to organize a seminar most likely on the Thursday morning. We'll post the update announcement later today or tomorrow on our website. So please stay tuned and see you next week. Thank you very much.